finishing up the first round of the story of Cain and Abel. So after the murder, and God says that Cain's going to be cursed. Verse 13, Cain says to Hashem, is my iniquity, which means my guilt, my crime, too great to be borne, which means carried? One of the ways that we describe God forgiving someone's transgression is that God carries it. No say of Fesha. No say means to carry. It means that the event took place and it had its destructive consequences, and that's a reality in the world. It has to be dealt with. And the person says, I can't deal with it alone. I can't manage it. I can't handle it. I'm asking Kodesh Baruch Hu to take it off my shoulders, so to speak. He says, is my crime so terrible that it can't be carried? And then he mentions how severe the punishment is. So the result is that Hashem says to him, number one, I'm threatening anyone who kills Cain will be severely punished. And number two, he gave him a sign that he should not be killed, so it's a sign of protection. Then in verse 15, at the very bottom of the page, 16, it says, Cain left the presence of Hashem and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now, if
east of Eden, you mean east of the Garden of Eden?
Well, no, there's a place called Eden, and there's a garden in that place. So,
I never knew.
I mean, it says actually God planted a garden in the land of an area called Eden. So Eden is the name of a place.
Sorry.
So it's east of that place. Now, if you know some Hebrew, when it says a vagrant and a wanderer, in the Hebrew it's na and nud, nun daled. And here he's settling in the place of Nod, nun daled. So if you have an ear for it, you think, that's interesting. So the oral tradition explains it as follows. God gave him a double punishment with two categories, no and Nod. And he ended up in a place called Nod, which is one out of the two, which means he didn't get the full punishment that he was threatened. He only got half. And so it says, Cain did a kind of tshuva, only it was a half-hearted tshuva. It was like a compromise. And God said, okay, you made a gesture to come back to me. You made a gesture to recognize what you had done. I'll respond in kind. Because your gesture wasn't complete, so I'm only going to compromise with you as well. But it isn't as if God says, it's all or nothing. Do it perfectly or forget it, I'm abandoning you. No, he did part. When he said, is my crime too serious to be carried, he is calling it a crime, isn't he? He's not justifying himself. He's not rationalizing. So he achieved for himself a certain partial rehabilitation and got a partial reduction in the punishment that he was condemned to. Yeah.
Seems like this whole story with Cain and Abel is after the sin of Adam and Chava.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought that it all
For sure.
supposedly happened on one day.
No, not this.
No?
This
completely...
No, not this. After all, the death wouldn't have been an option.
Right.
No. So that's the story on, so to speak, on the surface. There's a very famous Hasidic commentator named Shem Shmuel, the name of his sefer, who asks a fundamental question. Names in Hebrew typically are made out of words that have meaning. So, if you have, for example, someone's last name in English is Taylor, that probably means that somewhere in their ancestry there were people who made clothes. But and Smith comes from a smithy who works iron, so Smith also. But I don't know if Jones has a meaning. So not all names in English have meanings. Some do and some don't. In Hebrew, they typically do have meanings. And the meaning of a character in a scenario should play some role in explaining what his role was in that scenario. So he asked, let's take a look at the names of the two agents in this scenario and then see how we can integrate them into the events that took place. Cain, as she says, behold, I've acquired a man with Hashem, because kana, kuf nun hey, in Hebrew means to acquire. So Cain, based on the kuf and the nun, is a way of naming him in terms of acquisition. And in Hebrew and in English, the word acquisition is ambiguous between the thing acquired on the one hand and the process of acquiring on the other hand. It can mean either, in some contexts it can mean both. And the same thing is true in Hebrew. So you have to think of Cain as a person whose whole essence is expressed in acquiring and possessing. The other character in the story in Hebrew is Hevel, and that word is very familiar to those who are conversant with famous biblical sources, because if you look on page 1278, the book of Koheles, or Ecclesiastes in Greek. If you look at the Hebrew for a moment, and then we'll look at the translation, we'll look at the Hebrew. Divrei Koheles ben Dovid, Melech B'Yerushalayim, the words of Koheles, which is a name of King Solomon, son of David in Yerushalayim. Havel, Havalim, Amar Koheles. Havel, Havalim, Hakol, Havel. There you have the Hey Beis Lamed 5 times. And your translation reads, futility of futilities, all is futile. Hey Beis Lamed means roughly meaninglessness, worthlessness, insignificance, without substance, without impact, without character. The spirit in which the great desert in the southwestern United States is called the Dust Bowl. It's called Dust Bowl because, although it isn't strictly true, but typically dust doesn't support life. It just blows in the wind. It has no significance or meaning or value. That's the name of the second character in our story, Hevel. Emptiness. So the Shem Shmuel asks, what does the meaning of those names have to do with the story? And he gives a very deep and elaborate explanation. Before I present it, I just want to preface with a remark about interpretation. We spoke about this when we started this series a couple of weeks ago. But now I want to bring it up again and point out a certain nuance. We said then, when you interpret a book, there are two thoughts that some people have about how to interpret a book. In my view, one is accurate and the other is sheer nonsense. One thought is, I can say whatever I like about the book and interpret it in any way that pleases me, as long as nothing in the book says explicitly that my interpretation is false. If I say that a certain character is well, yeah, I will say it because it's true, let alone the politics that's going on in the world. If it says in a certain book that a character is referred to as he, and I want to interpret the text as that person being female, that's wrong. Because if it says he, then it's not female, it's male. That's a contradiction. But short of contradiction, you can say whatever you want. Interpretations are free and they're subjective, and you can do with it as whatever you please, as long as you don't just so now if I come to Macbeth and I say that Macbeth was trans, an XX who decided to behave like a male, does it say in Shakespeare's play that he wasn't trans? Is it written Trans? No, it isn't, right? So I can say he's trans. Why can't I? I can say whatever I want. That's ridiculous. Because that would make a mockery out of communication between people using language, using documents. And communication between people isn't mockery. There are agreed upon standards, though there are hard cases. There are hard cases in physics also. That doesn't mean it's all just a mockery. So that's ridiculous. What you really need is that the text presents positive evidence that the interpretation is true. Not just the interpretation is consistent, it should be supported by the book. Be able to point to various things to the book and say, you see, these things I can explain, and in the best possible case, without my explanation, they can't be understood. That's a good reason to support that interpretation. That's what we said a couple of weeks ago. Now, anyone who's worked with interpretation, especially in an explanation in science, knows that often you have a set of phenomena, a set of data, facts that need to be explained, and there's more than one way to explain them. So you can't say, without my explanation, it can't be understood. What you can say is, if there are 3 proposed explanations which so far would work for this set of data, there are also 330,000 ones that won't work. That means it's not free play, it's not subjective, you can't say whatever you want. The vast, vast majority of things you'll think up will be wrong, but there may be several that are right. And then the crucial question is, how do I look at the text in the light of, let's say, 2 different, even contradictory explanations, both of which could be supported by the data? The natural thought is to ask, well, which one is right? That's a mistake. Asking that question is a mistake. First of all, they might both be right. The text might be written in such a way that it has more than one meaning. Who says a text has to have only one meaning? Why can't the author intend to convey 2 different ideas by the same text? Furthermore, as you gather more data and you do more processing, it might turn out that they're both wrong, and that a third thing is correct. So you don't set it up as a competition. What you ask is this interpretation supported by the data? And is this interpretation supported by the data? Maybe one's better supported than the other. And then you have to make a judgment as to which one is better supported. But you don't start out with the assumption that it's a competition. So I'm going to present the Shem Shmuel's interpretation of the story. I gave this introduction because for many people they hear, wow, that's an interesting interpretation, it communicates a lot, but I can't believe that the text must be understood that way. I'm anticipating that reaction and I'm reinforcing it. Yeah, Could very well be. The text doesn't have to be interpreted that way or understood that way. It could be understood otherwise, but if you do succeed in understanding it some other way, that doesn't mean there's a competition, one's right and one's wrong. They could both be right. Okay, I'll tell you what he says. He says these two names, the names of the two characters, describe certain character types. And each of the character types has two developments, one positive and one negative. And the characters in this story illustrate the two character types, both negatively developed. Both negatively developed. So, let me explain to you what the types are. I mean, that we said that it looks like Cain is a criminal, right? He's the one who commits murder, and Hevel is either an innocent victim or a righteous person. But the Shem Yishmael is not going there, as you'll see. Cain, we said his name means acquisition. The process of acquiring and being the owner of things. He is what I would call the full personality type. He's full of himself. I'm clever, I'm hardworking, I'm gifted, I'm creative, and I can do a lot, and I can accomplish a lot, and I have a lot of assets working for me. Hevel is the opposite. His feeling is, I count for nothing. My life means nothing. And if you like, in the modern picture, in thousands, millions, billions of years, and the past, present, and future, and entropy will wipe out all of my accomplishments, which isn't true, but that's what he thinks. It's just wrong scientifically, but that's what he thinks. And therefore, it makes a difference if I do live, if I don't live, or what I do, or what I don't do. It's all just meaningless. Now, there are two ways to develop each type. The negative way for Cain to develop is, I'm so gifted, I'm so powerful, I'm so capable that everything else should serve me because I'm really better than everything else. The way in which the world will achieve its highest value is that if I should sit at the top of it, and everyone should recognize how great I am and serve me because he's so full of himself. The positive way to develop his character is to say, and this I think is something which in the modern world people do say, I am powerful, I am gifted, I am capable of great things. What project is worthy of my efforts? I don't want to waste the powers that I have on something that's trivial. Certainly not something that's false. I want to dedicate myself to something which is supremely meaningful, supremely valuable. Such a person, if he opens his eyes and explores the world objectively, will come to the understanding that there's a creator who manages the world, a hands-on creator who manages the world and has set a purpose for it and is guiding it towards that purpose. And aiding the purpose to get realized is the most valuable thing that you could possibly do. So he will come to find that his journey and his project should be to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the positive development. Now, with respect to Hevel, the negative development of his sense of meaninglessness is just a drift. Says it doesn't matter what he does. He doesn't make any decisions of principle, doesn't set up any priorities. He just drifts and does what comes to hand at the moment. The positive development would be to say, yes, I as an individual, as an isolated individual, don't make any difference. But there are joint projects that people are engaged in which make a big difference. And if I join that project, then my life becomes meaningful thereby. Because I'll be one of the ones who pushed that project to success. So, for example, during the Second World War, I know this happened in the United States, in England, when they're fighting the Nazis. There are people who weren't qualified to be inducted into the army who volunteered. They said, fighting the Nazis is the most important thing that one could possibly do, and I can't sit on the sidelines and let it happen without me. I have to participate. Realizing that there are 2 million soldiers on the Allied side, and 2,000,001 isn't going to make a measurable difference in the conduct of the war, but I become part of the group that earned the victory over the Nazis. That makes my life significant. I'll give you an example of this. I lived through Neil Armstrong setting his foot on the moon and the efforts that went into it. This was 1969. Imagine that the truth is that there were thousands of people working on the moonshot. There were lots and lots of things that had to be created and tested and so forth and so on. Let's imagine a person whose job it is to test oscilloscopes to make sure they're functioning correctly. They use oscilloscopes to test metals and so forth and so on. His job is just to test them and fix them if they need fixing. And he goes from installation to installation, and that's his job. What happens in 1969 when Neil Armstrong reaches the moon? How does he feel? Wow. We put a man on the moon, and I was part of it, because their instruments that they used to make it happen, I was the one who made sure those instruments were working properly. Imagine somebody else at the same time who also tests oscilloscopes in a factory that makes televisions. Could he feel the same satisfaction? They're doing the same job, but not in the same context, not for the sake of the same purpose. So Hevel says, if it's going to develop positively, it says, yes, as an individual alone, my life doesn't make any difference. But in a joint effort, I can be part of a program which really is meaningful, and that rescues my life from insignificance. Now, the Shem MiShmuel says, Cain and Hevel in this story are the negative development of each personality type. So Cain is the one who wants everything for himself, and he wants everybody to be subordinate to him, and Hevel is a drifter. Now, the Shem MiShmuel asks, as their lives are progressing and as they're living through the events that occur to them, which one is more likely to rethink, to reconsider his priorities and his direction? You could have different opinions about this, but Shem MiShmuel says Cain would be more likely to rethink because he has a project. He has a project of subordinating everybody else and running the world and dictating how its resources shall be moved. He's active and producing. And from time to time, he comes up against things that he can't control, like the weather. We were going to dry out the wheat, but then there was this storm and it was raining. So, we didn't get to dry out the wheat. So he's full of himself, and he's setting himself to control and make things happen and to subordinate, but he comes up against the world, which he can't control, and he has to make an accommodation to that, because his project of controlling everything has limits. And he also comes to the idea that there is a creator, or he inherited it from his creation, from his childhood. So, if there was a childhood, okay, the Midrash says otherwise. I'm not doing that now. So he has to make an accommodation. This is where the idea of offering the sacrifice comes from. If I offer a sacrifice, then maybe that power will recognize what I am and recognize what I want to do, and I'll be able to succeed. I can't control it, I can't subordinate it, but maybe I can get it to be on my side. But you can't give the best. Can't give the best, because that pushes him off the top. So he struggles, and he gives less quality of his sacrifice, a lower quality of his sacrifice. That's his inner struggle. What does Kodesh Baruch Hu do? Kodesh Baruch Hu says to him, I know you're struggling. I realize that you're struggling. And you're a person in process. and you have partially overcome your resistance, but not totally, I'm inviting you to finish it. Improve. Bring another sacrifice. Bring the best. And you'll be forgiven for this, and you'll be accepted. I'm inviting you to take the further steps in order to finish the process of coming to grips with the world in an appropriate way. What does Cain do? He kills his brother. And then, as I started out this afternoon, even then, when he wants to somehow atone for what he's done and recognize the crime, he still compromises. Because Baruch Hu says, okay, you're compromising. I'll compromise with you also. I decreed for you a double punishment. I'll rescind half of it. You'll get half of the punishment, not two parts, but one part. That's Cain's part. Hevel is drifting. What wakes him up is seeing what Cain does. Cain offers a sacrifice. Offering a sacrifice is a way of confronting and relating to the Creator. He thinks, wait a minute, there's a way out. I don't have to just drift. If I relate to the Creator and serve the Creator, then my life could take on meaning which would make it worthwhile. He gives the best. His giving the best isn't a struggle for him. Because for him, it's either nothing or everything. Without the sacrifice, he's nothing. And with the sacrifice, he can become, the sky's the limit. So of course he gives the best. Now, the best is the right sacrifice. And of course, Baruch Hu accepts it. That doesn't make him a great tzaddik. It makes him someone who did the right thing in the process of sacrifice. So of course, Baruch Hu accepted it. So he is converted into the positive, the positive element of attaching to Kodesh Baruch Hu, and becomes a positive exemplar of his personality type. Cain makes a halfway transition, but only a halfway transition. That's how the story goes here. We get it so far? According to Shem Shmuel, this interaction has a replay. A long time later, in Parshas Korach, because they are reincarnated, the two of them. Cain is reincarnated as Korach, and Hevel is reincarnated as Moses. And as you know, there is the challenge that Korach makes to Moses, and there's a struggle, and in this case, Korach is the one who is killed. It means it's the reverse, that the Hevel figure engineers the death of the Cain figure. So it's like a kind of historical outcome which undoes the damage of the previous. So let's see how this is reflected in verses. Okay, take a look at page 821. This is the rebellion of Korach. And it describes who the group of people are that gathered together with him to rebel against Moses. And then, in verse 3, you have their declaration. The declaration of Korach and his people. Okay. They gathered together against Moses and against Aaron and said to them, "It is too much for you. For the entire assembly, all of them, are holy, and Hashem is among them. Why do you exalt yourselves over the congregation of Hashem?" Well, let's see. these people, did they have any problem with the Creator? They have any problem in their relationship with God? Doesn't look like it. They speak of the entire assembly are holy, and Hashem is among them. And they call them the congregation of Hashem. Doesn't look like there's any problem with relating to Hashem. Their problem is other people. Who are you to set yourself higher than other people who are in the congregation of Hashem? The sentiment of the words, and I speak that way because in their hearts they meant something else entirely, which is following of the story shows. But the sentiment of the words is, we could call it democracy. No one is better than anybody else. The group is a group of equals. And since they're equals, you're taking positions of authority and dictating to the rest what they shall do is illegitimate. This is a partial rehabilitation of Cain, but only partial. And it's expressed in I guess this is a parable. There was a Hasidic Rabbi who sent his personal secretary, his Rabbi, out to check on one of his Hasidim, and in particular to check on his humility. So the Rabbi went out and did an investigation, came back, and he said to the Rebbe, your chassid is doing very well. He holds himself to be very small. It's just that he holds everybody else to be a little smaller. Meaning, he holds himself to be very small before God, but since God is infinite, that's not a big deal, to recognize that you're not infinite. You don't have to be very thoughtful and very balanced to understand that you're not infinite. But other people he holds smaller. So the idea of being full of yourself and putting yourself on top and putting yourself ahead, these people have solved half the problem. Vis-a-vis God, they're not challenging God. But to accept that other people might be superior to them, that they can't accept. That's a partial rehabilitation of Cain's personality type. What about Moses? Well, there's an incident. This is on page 795. There's a famous incident where Miriam spoke against Moses, claimed that he had done something that was incorrect. Chapter 12 says, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses regarding the woman who's married, whatever that is. And Hashem heard. And verse 3 says, the man Moses was exceedingly humble, more than any person on the face of the earth. So, that identifies him as the Hevel type. What did Moses do with being humble? Well, if you look down on page 795, God is speaking to them. Two lines from the bottom. Hear now my word, there shall be prophets among you. Visions, I Hashem make myself known to him, and dream I speak to him. Not so is my servant Moses. That's his servant is where your helpful, friendly English translator doesn't want you to have to bite the bullet. The word in Hebrew means slave. So, that being the case, that's what Moses did with his humility. He attached himself to a Kadosh Baruch Hu in completely unlimited terms, completely unrestricted terms. That's taking the empty personality type and developing it in a positive way, in the most spectacular fashion. And in fact, the very end of the Chumash says exactly the same thing on page 1123. When it records Moses' death, it says, so Moses, the servant of Hashem, or the Eved of Hashem, died there till the end of his life. But that's the way he was described. So you have Moses is the complete rehabilitation of Hevel's personality type, and Korach is the partial rehabilitation of Cain's personality type. And since Cain is only partial, there's still friction. Only this time, the Hevel figure, that's Moses, engineers the death of the Korach figure, and that reestablishes the balance in the tension between the two of them. So according to the Shem Shmuel, this is the ultimate end of the story, hundreds and hundreds of years later. And if you don't know that, then you don't realize how the sequence plays itself out to the end. Yeah.
The mic slipped.
Oh.
Recently.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that's why there's enduring conflict, and the conflict this time works out the opposite way, because Moses was fully the rehabilitation and Korach was only the partial rehabilitation. Now this is an illustration of how stories have to have layers, and the layers complement one another. With this deeper layer, you get a much deeper picture of of what's going on. We're together so far? So I want to make one more philosophical remark. It's common in literature, when you have a book that tells a story, to ask whether it's a story about real historical events or whether it was written in order to communicate a moral or an idea or a philosophy or has some message to teach. One could question that classification. It sounds like if it's real historical events, that you don't expect it to have a moral or teach a lesson or a philosophy or priorities or values, because the attitude is real historical events are just happenstance. They're out of control, and things happen for no particular reason. No one is guiding them. If you make up the story, then you're creating the events and you can craft them in such a way as to communicate an idea. Our picture of the world is not like that. On the contrary, nothing happens by accident, nothing happens without reason or meaning. Divine providence is managing the world. So we expect the real historical events to have a meaning, to teach a moral. Maybe it's not obvious what it is, but we expect them to have a meaning. So when we come to the stories in the Tanakh, we are understanding them as literally true historical events, but we are also understanding them as teaching some kind of moral, some kind of important philosophical idea. And you can see that in a certain way by the principle of selection. In a certain sense, there's an unlimited, perhaps even complete, infinite amount of information in the world. And when you record certain events from a particular place and time, you're selecting out a vast infinity of information, and you're picking some tiny slice of that information to be preserved. What's your principle of deciding what should be preserved, what shouldn't be preserved? Well, it depends upon your culture, it depends upon your priorities, and just what you're interested in. Our principle is the story teaches you something about how it is good to live your life. Even though the stories took place thousands of years ago, lots and lots of events took place thousands of years ago. We have only this tiny selection of what is preserved. It's preserved for that purpose. So these are real historical events which also teach a moral about the world. And when they're real historical events, then they get a certain credibility which they otherwise wouldn't have. Because if someone writes a novel and he crafts the events himself, it's not obvious that he's doing something that's realistic. That real people could do that sort of thing. That could naturally happen to real people. But when you know that it's a real historical event, then you know that that's not true. That it really did happen, and therefore can be dealt with directly as reality. Okay? Everybody with me? Fine. Let's push on.
Before we move on,
Yeah.
I think I had him ask a question for me yesterday because I couldn't be here, but we may have had a miscommunication of that. That's fine. So when Cain, or when after Cain kills Abel, then Hashem gives him a mark so that other people would know that he.
Well, so this is the mark of Cain, which people talk about, but that's not what it says in the text. It says he made for Cain a sign. Cain, not Cain, in Cain, but for Cain. One second. So, for example, the Ramban explains that when he set out on a trip, he would see a miracle, which reminded him that God promised him that he's not going to be killed on the trip. It's not the mark of Cain in his forehead. The contrary, showed him something which reassured him that the trip is not going to be dangerous. It says he made for him a sign so that those who find him won't kill him. So the idea of being condemned into it is just not in the text.
That wasn't my question.
Okay, but when you talk about a mark, the word mark sounds like a bodily blemish of some kind, right? And I'm pointing out that the text doesn't justify that. Yeah, go ahead.
My main question was so those others who find him know. Does that mean others who will be born in the future, or are there others?
Okay, so I asked this of my Rebbetzin when I went home for supper last night, and she pointed out to me something which I didn't pay attention to. She said, some of the commentators asked, who are these others who might kill him? And one of the answers that one of them gives is animals. Animals. The word in the text is very peculiar. Every that will find me will kill me. Every that will find me will kill me. What kind of talk is that? What's going to find him? He doesn't say people. Kol motzi yahageni. And the fear of mankind was put on the animals because many of the animals are stronger than human beings. And it says explicitly in the first chapter that God put the fear of human beings on the animals. And Cain said, I don't deserve that fear because of the crime that I have committed. So they won't be afraid of me and they'll kill me. So his fear was a fear of animals. So I thought to myself, boy, I never paid attention to the language. It is a very peculiar language. Kol motzi, any that find me will kill me. So if it's animals, it's an entirely different story. In other words, he thought he was forfeiting that kind of fear that humanity inspires in animals, because Baruch said, no, you're not forfeiting it. I'll give you something that will preserve it. But that's an entirely different picture of where it's coming from. And then you don't have the question, where did the people come that might... On the other hand, as we discussed it, this is not fixed in time. And Adam lived 930 years, so he could easily have had 800 children. And each one of them, getting to the age of 20, could start having children. So in the first few centuries, you got lots and lots of people. Right? The population is just going to explode. And so there certainly could be a human population, depends upon when it happened. Yeah.
But it says a sign.
What?
It says a sign, right?
Yeah.
So if it's a sign, that sounds singular, not like signs when these will come.
Oh, well, let's see. It is a sign, but it can repeat. It's not a one-time event. It's like Yaakov gave Paro a blessing. When he walks to the water comes to rise to meet him. That's a sign that he gave him. It happened every time he walked to the water. It didn't just happen, on June 6th and then be over.
It says specifically in the Torah that it's a sign to him?
No, it says he gave him a bracha. I'm just saying, how would we describe it? There are lots of magical powers. He gave him this power, and that power operated every time he came to the... Right? I don't see why we would even call that one sign.
So So you're saying that it could be that the sign was, he gave him a sign and that sign could have been repeated throughout.
Yeah.
But it was,
Yeah. Right? It was like one type of event and happened whenever he needed it. Okay, now I want to show you something in a passage which people find initially very boring and uninformative. Take a look at page 23. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I want 25. Chapter 5 of the book of Genesis. This is the account of the descendants of Adam. So, skip to verse 3. When Adam had lived 130 years, he begot his likeness and in his image, named him Sheth. The days of Adam after begetting Sheth were 800 years, got sons and daughters. All the days of Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. And now you have trios of verses, one after the other, for each generation. And the trio of verses is always the same. The first is the number of years until it describes his designated successor. And after that, he lived and begot sons and daughters. And then it sums up all the years and says he died. And it says that over and over and over again. So of course you wonder, what is the interest of the text in reciting it this way? And what is are these people selected? They lived very long lives. Is it that they and everybody else lived these long lives, but these were special people? Or was it only these who lived there? And the commentators are divided on that question. And anyway, you have these triples over and over again, and then you have one which is different. The bottom of the page, verse 21, Chanoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. Okay, that's the first designated successor. That's what it said above. Now the second sentence. Chanoch walked with God. Doesn't say that any place or anything like it above. For 300 years after begetting Methuselah, begot sons and daughters. Okay, that's the second sentence. It tells you the years that he had after the first one, and he got his sons and daughters. It says he walks with God. All the days of Chanoch were 365 years. Okay, that's part of the third sentence that you have above, but it doesn't say that he died. And now there's a fourth sentence, unlike all the others that have only three. And Chanoch walked with God. Now wait a minute. Didn't we just say that 2 lines ago? Same thing again. Why would you say it again? Then he was no more, for God had taken him. Oh. So he's not in the world anymore. So what's going on here? Well, what's being communicated here? And this isn't the end of the sequence, because the next page you have another trio. Methuselah lived 187 years, begot Lamech. That's the first designated successor. Methuselah 782 years afterwards, we got sons and daughters. All the days of Methuselah, and he died. That's the normal trio. It's just this one, which isn't the end of the sequence, is very different. So here, the commentators point out that if in 22 it starts with that Chanoch walked with God, and in 24 it says he walked with God again, it must be that in 24 you're not just stating the fact, which you already know, you didn't forget it in 2 lines. I know that with the internet generation, that's quite a hard thing to keep your attention that long, but probably this you could get. But here it means his walking with God was the reason why he was no more, for God had taken him. The first, in 22, it's the fact that he walked with God was what enabled him to live the extra years that he lived, and also it was what caused him to be taken from the world. Now, how could the very same thing be what enables a person to live and also cause him to be taken from the world? And is this taken from the world? Does it mean death? Is it just poetry for death? Or does it mean he didn't die? Here the text raises questions that you can't dismiss or ignore, but it really doesn't give you any clue how to answer them. Here's the way the oral tradition fills in the missing data to create a story that you can understand. These generations, as the subsequent text makes very clear, are generations that are descending towards the flood. The world population, the world culture, is deteriorating to the point where their continued existence can't be tolerated. It can't contribute to the goal that HaKadosh Baruch Hu set for mankind and for the creation as a whole. Well, if the generation as a whole is deteriorating, that puts pressure on the few people who really do have the right priorities and the right understanding of the world and worthy goals. It puts pressure on them. Everyone is subject to a certain extent to the pressure of his environment. Hanoch was one such person. How did he protect himself? He protected himself by focusing on his relationship with God and cutting out from his vision the rest of the world around him. I'm sure he had economic relationships with other people. You can't survive on your own if you're not producing and receiving and so forth and so on. But his perception and his vision simply filtered out those parts of the environment which would be a moral and spiritual challenge to him. That enabled him to preserve himself with enough integrity that his life could continue. But it was getting harder and harder. The society and the culture around him was disintegrating. And it got to the point where he was in danger of losing his grip, in danger of losing his detachment. So Kodesh Baruch Hu, as a favor to him, took him early, so that he shouldn't become deteriorated also and become overwhelmed by the social pressures that were around him. He lost close to 600 years. If you compare his age, 365, with the other numbers of years that people lived, he was drastically curtailed. But in a sense, it was a favor to him in his weakness, which he was not, as far as I know, he was not punished for or criticized for. That's who he was, and he did the best with what he had, and God didn't want him to be overwhelmed or destroyed. And this is a description of what it means to walk with God. That's going to be very important, because when we start to study Noach, probably tomorrow, it says he walked with God also. You have to realize that walking with God, if you only had those three words, you think, wow, what a wonderful level that is. What a supreme spiritual achievement that is. But we're learning from here that walking with God is an equivocal achievement. Not bad, but it has certain weaknesses. And as some of you know, what God said to Jacob, before he changed his name, is go before me. Not go with me, but go before me. And that's not the same level as walking with God. It's much superior. So we have to appreciate that this phraseology has nuances and subtleties, and it's not straightforward. Any question?
Yeah. So we find some places where Hashem takes years from a person, it's put to a different use or a different person. Is that the same case with, no?
Not that I know of. I'm not aware that his years were given to somebody else. No, I'm not.
It's not like a rule that needs to be given.
I don't think so. But your question is a good question. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think so. Can't say more than that. No, I don't. In the case of Adam, and there he agreed to it. Agreed to it. He's supposed to live to 1,000, and he gave up 70 years for Dovid HaMelech. But there it wasn't as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu took it away. He asked whether he agreed that should happen. I don't know as a general rule. Okay.